Picture a medieval monk writing by candlelight, describing a Viking execution so horrific it makes modern readers recoil. Yet this gruesome ritual might never have actually happened, existing instead as the ultimate propaganda victory. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to explore how the most gruesome Viking execution method might be more fiction than fact. We'll discover why medieval sagas describe the horrific blood eagle ritual in vivid detail, examine how modern anatomical science and archaeology challenge these accounts, and learn what Viking violence reality versus saga exaggeration, medieval propaganda, and the powerful reasons why terrifying stories persist across centuries tell us about the dark intersection of history, literature, and human psychology. The blood eagle. Even the name sends shivers down spines. According to medieval sagas, this was the Vikings' most spectacular and sadistic form of execution, reserved for the greatest enemies. The victim would be placed face down, their back cut open along the spine. The ribs would be severed from the backbone and pulled outward like wings. The lungs would be extracted and draped over these bone wings, still breathing, creating a grotesque eagle shape. Salt would be poured into the wounds, all while the victim supposedly remained alive, dedicated as a sacrifice to Odin, the All-Father of Norse mythology. It's an image that has haunted popular imagination for centuries, cementing Vikings' reputation as the most barbaric warriors in history. Television shows depict it in graphic detail. Heavy metal bands write songs about it. Video games include it as the ultimate finishing move. But here's the uncomfortable question historians have been grappling with. What if it never actually happened? What if the blood eagle is medieval fake news, a literary invention that took on a life of its own? To understand this puzzle, we must first examine where the blood eagle appears in historical sources. The ritual is mentioned in several medieval texts, but these sources were all written centuries after the Viking Age, mostly by Christian monks who had every reason to portray pagan Vikings as inhuman monsters. The earliest and most detailed accounts appear in sagas written in 13th century Iceland, at least 200 years after the events they describe. The Orkneyinga saga, written around 1230, provides one of the most cited blood eagle accounts. It describes how Torf Einar, a Viking Earl of Orkney, executed Halfdan Longleg, son of the Norwegian king Harald Fairhair. The saga states Einar had Halfdan's back cut open and the ribs pulled from the backbone, and he gave him to Odin as a victory offering. The language is relatively clinical, almost matter-of-fact, which some argue gives it credibility. But the most famous blood eagle victim was supposedly King Ælla of Northumbria, executed by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok in revenge for their father's death. This story appears in multiple sources, including Ragnar's saga, loðbrókar, and the tale of Ragnar's sons, both from the 13th century. These accounts add increasingly elaborate details: the lung extraction, the salt rubbing, the dedication to Odin. Each retelling seems to amplify the horror. Saxo Grammaticus, writing his Gesta Danorum around 1200, provides a Latin account that influenced many later interpretations. His version is particularly theatrical, emphasizing the ritual's religious significance and the victim's suffering. Saxo, despite being Danish, was a Christian cleric writing for a Christian audience, with clear motivations to emphasize pagan brutality. The most intriguing early reference might be in the Knut Strapa, a skaldic poem by Sighvatur Þórðarson from the 11th century, much closer to the Viking Age. The poem mentions that Ivar, one of Ragnar's sons, had Ella's back cut with an eagle, but here's where linguistics becomes crucial. The Old Norse could mean either that an eagle design was carved on the back, or that the back was cut open in the blood eagle fashion. This ambiguity has fueled centuries of debate. When we examine these sources critically, patterns emerge that should make us skeptical. First, the descriptions become more elaborate over time, a classic sign of legendary embellishment. Second, the victims are always significant figures, kings and princes whose dramatic deaths would make good stories. Third, the accounts often serve clear narrative purposes, justifying revenge, demonstrating Viking ferocity, or showing divine favour through spectacular sacrifice. Modern medical science delivers perhaps the most damning evidence against the blood eagle's historicity. anatomical analysis reveals that the ritual as described would be impossible to perform on a living victim. The moment the chest cavity is opened and the lungs exposed to air, they would collapse immediately. The victim would die from massive hemorrhage and shock long before the theatrical eagle display could be created. Dr. Monty Gates, a forensic pathologist who analysed the blood eagle accounts, concluded that death would occur within minutes of beginning the procedure. The severing of major blood vessels along the spine would cause catastrophic blood loss. The pain would likely cause immediate unconsciousness. The idea of a victim remaining alive through lung extraction is pure fantasy, medical impossibility dressed up as historical fact. The biomechanics of the described procedure also strain credibility. Pulling ribs outward from the spine requires enormous force and would likely break them rather than creating neat wings. The human rib cage isn't designed to open like a book. Even on a corpse, creating the described display would require tools and techniques that archaeological evidence suggests Vikings didn't possess. Archaeological evidence, or rather the lack thereof, provides another compelling argument against the blood eagle's existence. Despite extensive excavation of Viking Age sites, including execution grounds and massacre sites, no skeletal remains show the distinctive trauma pattern the blood eagle would leave. We find plenty of evidence for Viking violence, sword cuts, axe wounds, spear thrusts, but nothing resembling the systematic rib and spine damage the ritual would create. At the Viking massacre site at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, England, archaeologists found 54 decapitated Vikings, clear evidence of execution, but the bones show straightforward beheading, not elaborate torture. Similarly, at the St. Brice's Day massacre site in Oxford, where Vikings were killed by Anglo-Saxons, the skeletal trauma indicates quick, efficient killing, not ritualistic torture. When archaeologists do find evidence of Viking-age ritual activity, it looks very different from the blood eagle. At the temple site in Uppsala, Sweden, written sources describe hanging sacrifices to Odin. Archaeological evidence supports this. We find remains consistent with hanging, not elaborate chest surgery. The famous Tolland man and other bog bodies show evidence of ritual killing, but through hanging or throat cutting, not the impossible blood eagle. The absence of blood eagle victims in the archaeological record is particularly significant, given how distinctive the skeletal evidence would be. The specific pattern of rib damage, spinal trauma, and cut marks would be unmistakable. Forensic archaeologists can identify far subtler evidence of perimortem trauma. The fact that no such remains exist among thousands of excavated Viking-age burials strongly suggests the ritual never occurred. So if the blood eagle never happened, why do the sagas describe it in such detail? The answer lies in understanding who wrote these accounts and why. The vast majority of our Viking-age sources were written by Christian clerics, centuries after Scandinavia's conversion. These writers had powerful motivations to portray their pagan ancestors as barbaric and uncivilized. It justified the conversion and emphasized Christianity's civilizing influence. Medieval Christian writers regularly depicted pagans as inhuman monsters. This wasn't unique to Vikings. Similar propaganda targeted Native Americans, Africans, and any group Christian Europe sought to conquer or convert. The more barbaric the pagans seemed, the more necessary and righteous their conversion appeared. The blood eagle served this narrative perfectly, a ritual so horrific it could only be the product of demon worship. The political context of saga writing also matters. Many sagas were written during periods of conflict between Norwegian kings and Icelandic chieftains. Depicting Norwegian rulers' ancestors as victims of horrific torture served Icelandic political interests. It's no coincidence that blood eagle victims in the sagas are often Norwegian royalty or their allies. We must also consider the medieval literary tradition of amplificatio, the rhetorical technique of elaboration and exaggeration for dramatic effect. Medieval writers weren't bound by modern standards of historical accuracy. They freely embellished stories to make moral points, entertain audiences, or demonstrate literary skill. The blood eagle, with its vivid imagery and religious symbolism, provided perfect material for amplification. Comparative analysis with other medieval atrocity stories reveals similar patterns. Christian chronicles describe Muslims, Jews, and heretics performing impossible acts of sadistic violence. These accounts share features with blood eagle stories, elaborate rituals, impossible physiology, and convenient political messaging. Modern historians recognize most of these as propaganda, not history. The blood eagle likely belongs in the same category. Understanding real Viking execution methods helps contextualize why the blood eagle stands out as likely fiction. Historical and archaeological evidence confirms Vikings used various execution methods, but they were generally straightforward and practical. Hanging was by far the most common method, used for criminals and sacrificial victims alike. The god Odin was specifically associated with hanging. He was called Lord of the Gallows, and mythologically hanged himself on the world tree Yggdrasil. Beheading was reserved for higher status victims, considered a more honourable death than hanging. We have extensive archaeological evidence of decapitation executions, including mass execution sites. The Viking Age law codes specify beheading for certain crimes, and saga accounts of beheadings generally match archaeological evidence, unlike blood eagle accounts. Drowning appears in legal texts as punishment for certain crimes, particularly those considered shameful. Women convicted of adultery might be drowned, as might men guilty of cowardice. Burning was rare but documented, usually for practitioners of harmful magic or in cases of extreme revenge. Stoning appears occasionally, typically as mob justice rather than formal execution. What's notable about these confirmed execution methods is their practicality. Vikings were efficient killers when necessary. Their success as warriors depended on it. The elaborate, time-consuming, technically impossible blood eagle doesn't fit this pattern. Real Viking executions were quick and effective, not theatrical torture sessions. The religious context of Viking violence reveals more problems with blood eagle accounts. Vikings did practice human sacrifice, but evidence suggests it followed specific patterns that don't match the blood eagle. The written sources describing Uppsala temple sacrifices mention hanging victims in sacred groves. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, describes bodies of humans, horses and dogs hanging together. Gruesome but straightforward. Archaeological evidence of Viking ritual killing supports hanging and throat-cutting as primary methods. The bog bodies predating the Viking Age show these same patterns continuing. When Vikings made sacrificial offerings, they followed established religious traditions. The blood eagle, with its unprecedented elaboration, doesn't fit known patterns of Norse religious practice. The dedication to Odin aspect of blood eagle stories also raises questions. While Odin received human sacrifices, he was specifically associated with hanging, spears and ravens, not eagles. The eagle imagery seems forced, possibly a misunderstanding of skaldic poetry's metaphorical language. Scholars suggest the original references might have meant marking with an eagle, carving a symbol, rather than creating an eagle shape from the victim's body. Literary analysis of blood eagle accounts reveals how they function as narrative devices rather than historical records. In saga literature, the blood eagle always serves specific story purposes, demonstrating ultimate revenge, showing divine approval, or marking narrative climax. It never appears as casual background detail, but always as a pivotal dramatic moment. The literary evolution of blood eagle accounts is telling. Early skaldic poetry contains ambiguous references that might mean simply killed or marked with an eagle symbol. Later, prose sagas elaborate these into increasingly detailed torture scenarios. This pattern, from vague poetic allusion to elaborate prose description, suggests literary invention rather than historical transmission. Saga writers drew on various sources for dramatic inspiration, including classical literature, Roman accounts of Germanic brutality, biblical descriptions of martyrdom, and contemporary medieval torture practices all provided material. The blood eagle synthesizes these influences into something uniquely horrific, designed to surpass all other literary atrocities. The role of oral tradition in shaping these stories can't be ignored. As tales pass through generations of storytellers, dramatic elements naturally amplified. A simple execution becomes a ritual killing. A ritual killing becomes elaborate torture. By the time Christian scribes recorded these stories, centuries of oral embellishment had transformed whatever kernel of truth might have existed. The psychological effectiveness of the Blood Eagle story reveals why it persisted and spread. The ritual combines multiple horror elements: helplessness, body violation, religious perversion, and spectacular visual imagery. It's designed to be unforgettable, to lodge in memory and spread through retelling. This psychological stickiness ensures the story's survival regardless of truth. Modern popular culture has embraced the Blood Eagle with disturbing enthusiasm. Television shows like Vikings depict it in graphic detail, presenting saga fiction as historical fact. Video games use it as a finishing move, trivializing what would be an atrocity if real. Heavy metal bands celebrate it in lyrics and album art. This popular culture amplification spreads the myth far beyond academic circles. The appeal seems rooted in the desire to see Vikings as ultimate warriors, more brutal, more hardcore than other historical peoples. The Blood Eagle serves this narrative perfectly. It makes Vikings seem superhuman in their capacity for violence, feeding modern fantasies about hyper-masculine warrior culture. The goriness provides shock value in an entertainment landscape constantly seeking extremes. But this popularization has real consequences. It perpetuates harmful stereotypes about medieval Scandinavians and their descendants. It obscures the genuine complexity of Viking Age society, their law codes, poetry, craftsmanship, and exploration. The Blood Eagle myth reduces a sophisticated culture to a caricature of mindless brutality. Academic pushback against Blood Eagle mythology has intensified in recent decades. Historians like Roberta Frank have meticulously dismantled the supposed evidence, showing how linguistic misunderstandings and literary elaboration created the myth. Archaeologists point to the total absence of physical evidence. Medical experts explain the anatomical impossibility. Yet the myth persists because it serves modern needs as effectively as it served medieval ones. For some, it represents authentic masculinity in a supposedly feminized world. For others, it's simply cool, a piece of historical exotica that sets Vikings apart. The truth seems less interesting than the legend, so the legend survives despite scholarly debunking. The question of whether any kernel of truth exists behind Blood Eagle accounts remains open. Perhaps Viking warriors did carve eagle symbols on defeated enemies' backs, a gruesome but plausible battle practice that later transformed into something impossible. Perhaps poetic descriptions of carrion birds feeding on the slain metamorphosed into ritual creation of human eagles. Some scholars suggest the Blood Eagle might represent garbled memories of actual Viking atrocities, transformed through centuries of retelling. Vikings certainly committed brutal acts during raids and wars. Perhaps especially horrific killings became legendary, accumulating impossible details through oral tradition. The Blood Eagle would then be mythology built on a foundation of genuine horror. The linguistic evidence remains frustratingly ambiguous. Old Norse kennings, poetic metaphors, often involve eagles and ravens as battlefield imagery. To give someone to the eagles meant to kill them in battle, leaving corpses for scavengers. These poetic conventions might have been misunderstood by later prose writers, transforming metaphor into literal description. We must also consider that different versions of the Blood Eagle might have coexisted. Perhaps someone somewhere attempted to perform the ritual as described, failing for anatomical reasons but creating a legendary attempt. Or perhaps the threat of the Blood Eagle, never actually performed, served as psychological warfare. The ambiguity itself might be historical. The Blood Eagle controversy illuminates how we study and understand the past. It demonstrates the importance of source criticism, questioning who wrote accounts, when, and why. It shows how archaeological evidence can confirm or refute written sources. It reveals how modern science can evaluate historical claims. Most importantly, it reminds us that the past is often messier and more complex than neat narratives suggest. The persistence of the Blood Eagle myth also reveals uncomfortable truths about contemporary society. Our appetite for Viking brutality says more about us than about them. We want Vikings to be savage because it satisfies something in our cultural psyche, perhaps a longing for clarity and moral simplicities, where brutal pagans gave way to civilized Christians. But history resists such simplicities. Vikings were complex people living in complex societies. They could be brutal raiders and sophisticated poets, savage warriors, and careful lawmakers. They were human beings, not caricatures. The blood eagle myth obscures this humanity behind a screen of impossible sadism. As we examine how the blood eagle story spread and evolved, we see patterns repeated throughout history. Atrocity propaganda follows predictable paths. Initial ambiguous reports become detailed descriptions. Enemy otherness justifies impossible brutality. Each retelling adds horrific details. Eventually, myth becomes accepted fact. Understanding these patterns helps us evaluate not just medieval propaganda, but modern claims as well. The role of confirmation bias in perpetuating the blood eagle myth deserves attention. Once people believe Vikings performed such rituals, they interpret ambiguous evidence as confirmation. Poetic metaphors become literal descriptions. Artistic depictions become historical proof. Scholarly skepticism gets dismissed as political correctness. The myth becomes self-reinforcing. Professional historians face an uphill battle against entrenched mythology. Academic articles debunking the blood eagle reach tiny audiences, while television shows depicting it reach millions. Careful scholarly analysis can't compete with dramatic visual representation. The myth has escaped academic control, living independently in popular culture. This raises questions about historians' responsibilities regarding popular myths. Should scholars actively combat false but harmless historical beliefs? Does it matter if people believe Vikings performed impossible executions? Some argue that historical accuracy always matters. Others suggest focusing on more consequential myths. The debate continues without resolution. The blood eagle serves as a case study in how historical knowledge develops and changes. Early antiquarian scholars accepted saga accounts uncritically. Later, historians began questioning sources. Modern interdisciplinary approaches, combining history, archaeology, medicine, and linguistics, revealed the myth's impossibility. This progression shows scholarship improving over time. Yet we must remain humble about our own limitations. Future scholars may reveal blindnesses in our current understanding. Perhaps new archaeological discoveries will complicate the picture. Perhaps linguistic analysis will reveal nuances we've missed. The blood eagle's impossibility seems clear now, but historical consensus can shift with new evidence. Examining why the blood eagle myth matters leads to broader questions about historical truth and cultural memory. Does it matter whether Vikings actually performed this ritual? On one level, yes. Historical accuracy matters for its own sake. Understanding what really happened in the past helps us understand how we got to the present. False history leads to false conclusions about human nature and society. But the myth also matters for what it reveals about myth-making itself. The blood eagle shows how stories evolved to serve contemporary needs. Medieval Christians needed pagan barbarity to justify conversion. Modern audiences need Viking savagery to feed entertainment appetites. The myth adapts to each era's requirements, revealing more about the tellers than the told. The gender dynamics embedded in blood eagle mythology deserve examination. The ritual represents masculine violence taken to impossible extremes. All recorded victims are men. All perpetrators are male warriors. The saga accounts present this hyper-masculine violence as admirable, proof of Viking superiority. Modern depictions often maintain this framing, using the blood eagle to represent ultimate masculinity. This gendered violence serves specific cultural functions. For medieval audiences, it reinforced warrior hierarchies and masculine honor codes. For modern audiences, it offers escapist fantasy from perceived masculine crisis. The impossible brutality becomes a symbol of lost masculine power, appealingly transgressive in its extremity. Critical analysis reveals how the blood eagle myth reinforces harmful gender stereotypes. It reduces masculinity to capacity for violence. It presents brutality as strength rather than weakness. It obscures the complex gender dynamics of actual Viking society, where women held significant economic and social power. The myth simplifies and distorts for ideological purposes. The racialization of Viking imagery, including the blood eagle, presents another troubling dimension. White supremacist groups have adopted Viking symbols, using myths of Viking brutality to represent racial superiority. The blood eagle becomes part of a racist fantasy about pure warrior ancestors, unconquered by Christian weakness. This appropriation distorts historical Vikings beyond recognition. Viking Age Scandinavia was connected to diverse trade networks spanning from Baghdad to Constantinople to Dublin. Vikings intermarried with local populations wherever they settled. Their society was complex and cosmopolitan, not the racially pure warrior culture supremacists imagine. The Blood Eagle myth feeds these distortions by presenting Vikings as uniquely, impossibly violent. Scholars have pushed back against racist Viking appropriation, but mythology proves harder to combat than history. The Blood Eagle's impossibility doesn't matter to those using it for ideological purposes. They need Vikings to be ultimate warriors. Historical accuracy is irrelevant. The myth serves their narrative regardless of truth. Educational challenges arise from Blood Eagle mythology's prevalence. How do teachers address students who've seen graphic depictions in popular media? How do museums present Viking history without reinforcing myths? How do public historians compete with entertainment's sensationalism? These practical questions lack easy answers. Some educators use the Blood Eagle as a teaching opportunity about source criticism and historical methodology. By examining how the myth developed, students learn to question sources and evaluate evidence. The Blood Eagle's impossibility becomes a lesson in critical thinking rather than Viking history per se. Museums face particular challenges in addressing popular myths while maintaining visitor engagement. Simply stating, "the Blood Eagle never happened," alienates visitors invested in the mythology. More effective approaches explore why the myth developed and what it reveals about both Viking Age and contemporary societies. The myth becomes a window into cultural processes rather than historical events. Digital humanities approaches offer new ways to trace the Blood Eagle myth's evolution. Text analysis of saga manuscripts reveals how descriptions changed over time. Network analysis shows how the myth spread through medieval literature. Social media analysis tracks contemporary myth propagation. These tools provide quantitative support for qualitative historical arguments. The economics of Viking mythology, including the Blood Eagle, shapes how history gets presented. Television shows featuring graphic violence draw viewers. Museums displaying weapons attract more visitors than those emphasizing textiles. Books promising Viking savagery outsell those exploring Viking poetry. Market forces incentivize mythology over history. This economic pressure affects even academic publishing. Books debunking Viking myths sell fewer copies than those embracing them. Publishers push authors towards sensationalism. Grant funding favors projects with public appeal. The Blood Eagle myth persists partly because debunking it isn't profitable. Yet some creators successfully challenge Viking stereotypes while maintaining popular appeal. The show Norseman satirizes Viking brutality, showing the absurdity of hyper-violent mythology. Some historical fiction authors emphasize Viking complexity over simplistic savagery. These successes suggest audiences might accept nuanced Vikings if given the chance. The Blood Eagle myth's persistence reveals the power of vivid imagery over abstract analysis. People remember the horrific visual of lungwings more than scholarly debunking. The myth's grotesque specificity makes it memorable in ways that Vikings mostly just hanged people isn't. This psychological reality shapes how historical knowledge spreads. Understanding this psychological dimension suggests strategies for more effective myth-busting. Rather than simply stating the Blood Eagle's impossibility, historians might emphasize equally vivid truths about Viking society. The image of Viking women managing estates while men raided, the complexity of Viking Age law codes, the sophistication of skaldic poetry. These positive images might compete with negative mythology. The interdisciplinary nature of Blood Eagle research demonstrates modern scholarship's strengths. Historians provide textual analysis. Archaeologists contribute physical evidence. Medical experts evaluate anatomical claims. Linguists parse Old Norse ambiguities. This collaboration reveals truths invisible to any single discipline. Future research directions might further illuminate the Blood Eagle controversy. Experimental archaeology could test what battlefield mutilations were actually possible with Viking Age tools. Digital reconstruction might visualize why the described ritual is impossible. Neuroscience could explore why such myths persist despite debunking. Each approach adds understanding. Climate science offers an unexpected angle on Viking brutality myths. The medieval warm period enabled Viking expansion by opening sea routes and improving agricultural yields. Environmental abundance, not savage brutality, explains Viking Age success. The blood eagle myth obscures these material factors behind a screen of imagined violence. Examining parallel myths from other cultures provides comparative perspective. Many societies have impossible torture myths serving similar functions to the blood eagle. Chinese histories describe elaborate execution methods that medical analysis proves impossible. Medieval European accounts of Jewish ritual murder follow similar patterns. Understanding these parallels helps contextualize Viking mythology. The question of whether any Vikings believed in the blood eagle, even if they never performed it, remains intriguing. Perhaps saga writers thought they were recording real history. Perhaps Viking Age people told blood eagle stories as warnings or boasts. The myth's truth might matter less than its cultural function in Viking society. This raises philosophical questions about historical truth. If Vikings believed in the blood eagle, does that belief constitute a kind of historical reality? How do we balance material truth, it never happened, with cultural truth, people thought it did? These questions extend beyond Viking studies to fundamental issues in historical epistemology. As we near the end of our exploration, what conclusions can we draw? The blood eagle almost certainly never happened as described in the sagas. Medical impossibility, archaeological absence, and source criticism all point toward literary invention. The myth developed through centuries of elaboration, serving various cultural needs while obscuring historical reality. Yet the myth's persistence teaches valuable lessons. It demonstrates how propaganda shapes historical memory. It reveals contemporary appetites for extreme violence. It shows how entertainment can overwhelm education. Most importantly, it reminds us to approach all historical claims with careful skepticism. The real Vikings were fascinating enough without impossible tortures. They navigated unknown oceans, established far-flung trade networks, created sophisticated literature, and developed complex legal systems. They adapted to diverse environments from Greenland to the Mediterranean. Their true history surpasses any mythology in its human drama. Perhaps the blood eagle's greatest victim is Viking Age history itself, murdered by its own impossible mythology and transformed into something unrecognizable. The real Vikings, complex and human, disappear behind screens of fictional savagery. Our task as historically conscious people is to rescue them from their myth, revealing the fascinating truth behind the legend. As you finish your tea and reflect on this journey through Viking mythology and reality, consider what other historical facts might deserve similar scrutiny. What stories do we accept because they fit our preconceptions? What myths persist because they serve contemporary needs? The blood eagle reminds us that historical truth requires constant vigilance against the allure of dramatic fiction. The next time you encounter Viking imagery in popular culture, whether blood eagles or horned helmets, remember the complex reality behind the myth. Real Vikings were neither savage monsters nor noble warriors, but human beings navigating their world with the tools available to them. Their successes and failures, violences and kindnesses, innovations and traditions make them far more interesting than any impossible torture could. In the end, the blood eagle teaches us as much about ourselves as about Vikings. Our willingness to believe the worst about the past, our appetite for extreme violence, our preference for simple narratives over complex truths, all reveal contemporary anxieties and desires. Perhaps by understanding why we want to believe in the blood eagle, we can better understand both history and ourselves.